This is the fourth installment of the National Consultation on Education 2021-2022 under the overall theme of Education, Passport to the Future. I'm DK Roster. Now, so far we have discussed equity in quality education, curriculum reform, TVET revitalization, and that brings us to the Education Act. The Education Act is the governing authority which relates to matters concerning education. The legislative framework will have to be compatible with the realities and plans of the education sector for effective execution of its power conferred by the interpretation of statutes and regulations. Now, to help us look at the Act in greater detail, we are joined by Sherry Ann Rollocks Hackett, proud Tobagonian from Plymouth, an educator for over 30 years who has taught and served in several capacities in the secondary and tertiary education sectors throughout Trinidad and Tobago. Now, presently, Mrs. Rollocks Hackett is the School Supervisor 3 at the Division of Education, Research and Technology, Tobago House of Assembly. In studio with us, we have Mr. Ashram Deoraj, a gentleman who has served as Director of School Supervision and Management at the Ministry of Education, responsible for the leadership and management of school supervisors in all districts. He has worked with student support services on developing strategies to deal with social issues facing students. He was a member of the committee to draft regulations for teaching. And we also have Ms. Darlene Smith rounding out our panel, Guidance Officer at the Ministry of Education. She's also a motivational speaker, consultant, and a social worker. She has worked with a wide spectrum of organizations, including the Children's Authority and several NGOs. Ms. Smith is an advocate for the rights of the child and a champion against child abuse, and brings a wealth of experience to our education landscape. Now, please remember that your views and inputs matter. Leave your comment or questions on social platforms. Call us live at 622-4010. WhatsApp us at 776-0440. And most importantly, please visit the ministry's website at moe.gov.tt to make your contribution in black and white to this consultation. Now on to the Education Act. And I want to ask, please, and I'll start off with you, please, Ms. Rollocks Hackett, what do you consider when you hear quality education? Ms. Rollocks Hackett, can you hear us?
Yes, but you're very faint. I'm hardly hearing.
All right, so we'll try to sort that out, but we'll start in studio. Ms. Smith, when you hear quality education, what are the things that really come to the fore?
Quality education, to me, should really provide inclusive education to all children. We're talking here about the gifted, the average, children with disabilities, to ensure that we're able to meet and prepare them for life after school. And in doing that, it means providing them with life skills, providing them with support. Quality education should also include accountability for all critical stakeholders, to ensure that we're able to meet the child's personal, social, and academic development.
I hear inclusivity, I hear accountability. Mr. Deoraj, quality education. What do you make of that?
For me, quality education, from the time you say quality, we start signaling in our minds this whole question of standards. But I think it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that in terms of educators' preparation, practice, and outcome. Because at the end of it, we have to deliver according to a standard that we have established. To some extent, the school-based management model had attempted to create some kind of standards that we could all aspire to. The experience of a child, let's say in Fatima College, should be the same as a child in Barataria North or Penal Secondary. So when we start thinking about quality, we automatically start looking at the standards that we will try to achieve and the purpose of education and the road to take it to reach that level.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Rollocks Hackett, quality education, what does that mean to you?
Okay, good night, everyone. For me, quality education equals effectiveness, efficiency. You talk about standards, I've heard that mentioned thus far, relevancy. To me, it's about differentiation. It's not about one size fitting all. It's about inclusiveness and it's also about accountability and the enabling of our learners so that at the end of the day, they are able to realize their fullest potential. And that, in essence, for me, is what quality education is all about. And I think that's what we as educators, we strive to ensure that we have that level of effectiveness and efficiency at our schools.
Thank you so much. And in this opening segment where we're trying to get things, build it up from the ground, as it were, looking at the Education Act, legislation, words have meaning and weight. So I want to start off, Mr. Deoraj. School. What do we mean by school?
A school is supposed to be a learning institution where every child, no matter what their social standing is, to go with the national anthem, every creed and race, the opportunities afforded to each child can be found in a school. No matter which school you go to, the opportunities to participate, to integrate into the learning environment must be made available to all.
And the fact that you use the word institution, and I think the Act says it's an institution approved by the minister, has that changed a little bit during the course of the pandemic, Ms. Smith?
Not really. We have expanded, I believe, because of the online learning versus the face-to-face, so that it has, while it has expanded to facilitate the needs of the children during the pandemic, the institution of school still remains constant. And it has too, because at the end of the day, we have to have structure and we have to be able to execute these very standards that Mr. Deoraj is alluding to.
All right, thank you so much. Mrs. Rollocks Hackett, has the disruption of the pandemic kind of enlarged our scope of what school can be, or should it have?
To an extent, it has expanded. Having our students operating on a virtual environment challenged the entire school system, just as it challenged the entire world. And, you know, educators, whether teachers, principals, once you're in the work of education, you found yourself having to really, you know, become very innovative in order to continue to meet the needs of the students, even though they are not in front of you face-to-face classes. So I would say, yes, it did expand. And also, when we talk of school, school must also be a safe place. So the issues of ensuring that students are able to realize their potential and caters for all the needs of the students, the institution, whether it's operating on a virtual platform or otherwise, must create that environment that enables the child and allows the child to feel safe and cared for. So that's where you have the pastoral arm of schooling. And that's also important.
And I see some nods of assent happening, but with all that and that context, where does the Education Act come into play here? And I just throw that out in the last minute that we have in the segment. Anyone want to take a bite of that first?
Well, the Education Act has to prepare for the legal framework that is necessary to support the education system. I think that even though that we have a changed way of curriculum delivery because of COVID, it pointed out a couple of different areas where we fell short, the technological divide and so on, the kind of support that is required. If you have to go through legislation, the Education Act will, of course, look for trying to see what the purpose of education is and putting mechanisms in place to ensure equity in the system.
And with that, we are, do I get a quick nod or yes or no from you, Ms. Smith?
Totally concur.
All right, thank you so much. We continue the conversation. When we return, we are looking at the Education Act, and we are doing it here at this point in time, reminding you, you can send us a WhatsApp at 776-0440. You can call us at 622-4010. Send a question or comment on social platforms and moe.gov.tt. Send your comments in. We'll return after this with more.
The world has changed, and with every day, our children's future takes on a different shape. How do we prepare them for a future that is uncertain? One where their education, in whatever form it takes, is their only passport for the future. This is the focus of the National Education Policy for the period 2022 to 2027. We all have a stake in our children's tomorrow, so we must all have a voice today. The Ministry of Education began this conversation with the nation in November 2020, when we said it takes a village. We listened to you, the members of the village, and drafted 8 areas of focus for education for the next 5 years. These are TVET revitalization, curriculum reform, digital transformation, Education Act, equity in quality education, transition of learners, enabling student success, and human resource development. We then continued the conversation in December 2021. We consulted with key stakeholders in the education ecosystem, including the Representative Union for Teachers, parent groups, school boards, and tertiary level institutions. Having received and incorporated their recommendations, the Ministry of Education is coming back to the national population for their views and opinions on the draft concept note for the National Policy on Education 2022 to 2027. This is your opportunity to join the conversation. Let your voice be heard. There are 4 ways for you to comment. Visit moe.gov.tt for the draft concept note. Then you can share your views on moe.gov.tt. Call in during the televised broadcast. WhatsApp your views to 776-0440 or comment on the ministry's social media pages during the live stream. Visit the Ministry of Education social media pages for further details. Education is a passport for the future, and share your views and help our children take flight.
The following feature on TNT Icons in Science is brought to you by Nehurst. Which TNT aeronautical engineer and inventor designed military aircraft that gave the Allied forces air superiority in World War II? Conrad Lowe, who attended Queen's Royal College and later MIT, was the lead designer of the famous fighter planes, the F-4U Corsair, the F-7U Cutlass, and the F-8U Crusader. To learn more on Conrad Lowe and other local icons, log on to www.nehurst.gov.tt.
Welcome back. We are discussing the Education Act with Mr. Ashram Deoraj, Sherian Rollox-Hackett, and Darlene Smith. And I want to introduce the idea of the inspectorate. What do you think are some of the requirements for that inspectorate to work the way that it should towards education, Ms. Smith?
The inspectorate is a critical arm of any education system. Throughout the world, they have various inspectors operating. In Trinidad, the public schools, we have school supervisors operating in a similar way, right? So that their role is to have the monitoring of the education sector and the schools in particular, in terms of ensuring that the children's names are registered in the school, in the ministry is lodged, that the list of the children who are vaccinated are lodged, that the attendance of the children is lodged, so that we're able to monitor performance, attendance, and of course, at the end of the day, academic development and abilities, so that this is Ministry of Education. So our focus would be the overarching education development of our students.
And I want to get your take on that, please, Mrs. Rollox-Hackett. In terms of, like, what are some of those things that the inspectorate should be bringing to the table for education in Trinidad and Tobago to be the way you would like to see it?
Well, the whole idea of an inspectorate, I think is something that we have to really look at and examine as far as relevancy. Already we have mentioned in the Education Act, we speak of school supervisors, and they have a trustworthy responsibility to monitor and to ensure that the standards are kept as far as maintaining educational effectiveness, ensuring that the curriculum in concert with the curriculum unit is delivered in the way it's supposed to be delivered, that students are enabled, and that education is conducted in keeping with the various tenets as outlined in the Education Act. So they monitor. So having inspectorate operating at another level, we have to determine whether or not we need to add that or to include that in the document. But one might also think that because to a large extent, what we do in education has expanded as a result of this hybrid system that we now have and the online platform that we have been forced to embrace somewhat, that the amount of monitoring and accountability that might be required, there might be need for an added element or added arm to what the school supervisors currently do. And in that sphere, I can see an inspectorate being relevant at this point in time, because monitoring also what happens the online platform, and we are moving into e-testing and all these areas, and it is important to be able to capture what is happening in order to maintain standards. Then I will see that being an element that could be added, yes.
All right, thank you so much for that. And I want to follow that point with you, please, Mr. Deoraj. Do you see a gap between what exists right now with school supervisors and what the inspectorate would be asked to perform? And just before you do that, I want to put in the question that when will early childhood be included in the Education Act? So that is something that we're going to come to, but asking you for that first, though.
Okay, I really don't understand if there is going to be a gap per se, unless you expand the duties and responsibilities as set out under Section 26 of the Education Act, which goes in detail of what a school supervisor does. If you're going to add responsibilities now to that particular role of a school supervisor and expect them to do more, we have to outline exactly what that more is. It's only when we know what that more is in terms of what the Ministry of Education is trying to achieve, then we will have to decide if another warm body is necessary to add to the cadre that already exists.
And some of the things that I can see presenting themselves very readily are whether or not children are accessing online classes, looking at the conditions of children during class while they're doing virtual, because one of the complaints and anecdotally and otherwise is that children are at school at home or by a guardian, and other things are happening in that environment that would not necessarily happen in the school environment, possibly needing to be addressed in one way or the other. But we also have the question, when is early childhood going to be included on the Education Act? When do you think we can expect that, Ms. Smith?
Given that we have approximately 1,000 early childhood centers throughout the country, it means the conversation that we're having here is guiding us on the correct pathway. Because if we don't regularize and protect the ECCE children, it means that they're at risk, all right? And therefore, it needs to happen urgently, and I know that the discussions and these consultations are carrying us in the right direction for the revision of the Education Act for that inclusive.
And I want to throw that to you, please, Mrs. Rollocks Hackett, because we're looking at the effectiveness of the Education Act. So in terms of including early childhood education, what are some of those things that you think about when you try to marry those two? Because I know you keep on speaking about relevancy, so I want to ask you about that as well.
Well, even as we piggyback on that word relevancy, I think we will all agree that it is quite overdue for the Education Act to include and to be expanded to include the early childhood sector. That's a relevant area of education. As you talk about education, we talk about from the cradle to the grave. And therefore, if we are speaking about education in those terms, we have to ensure that our Education Act here in Trinidad and Tobago also includes the early childhood sector. I know that we have various policy documents already that seeks to determine and to guide and monitor the delivery of early childhood education or the early childhood sector in Trinidad and Tobago. But we need to do more than that. And as the former speaker indicated, these consultations, I believe, are heading in the right direction, and it's an indication that, yes, we need to expand to include it.
And in terms of that expansion, private education institutions, Mr. Deoraj, where will the inspectorate have responsibility for them?
Okay, under the private schools, they already exist in the present legislation under the Act.
Yes.
Under sections 30 to 37. So you have in 30 to 37 all the tenets and requirements that falls under the obligations of a private school. They are all there already. Maybe it needs to be examined further, and I am sure that with consultation with the Private Schools Association, I am sure that they will have a common mind, because what they're looking for is to ensure, when we come back to the quality and standards, we come back to that, because if we are looking at public institutions and private institutions offering education, then we need to make sure that we are always delivering quality. And I think that even with the inspectorate and looking at the legislation, it certainly can be expanded, but I think through consultation.
And in terms of that consultation, we are reminding you of the ways that you can get your points, comments, questions across. Remember, moe.gov.tt to make your comment affected in black and white, so that it will go into the entire mix of suggestions that are going forth. You can give us a message or question via WhatsApp 776-0440, or you can call us at 622-4010 to join us live. And the fact that there's still so much virtual classrooms happening, the role of attendance, because you're talking about registration, attendance, how do we treat with truancy during an issue like this?
Truancy has continued even through the pandemic. Truancy for the pandemic would be the child who registers for class in the morning, takes the roll, and then disappears. So that was happening right through from the onset of the pandemic. And they would have, some students claim that their Wi-Fi connection would have fallen, but other friends would say, but no, miss, they're online. They're seeing them, they're messaging their peers, so you know they have access to Wi-Fi. They just choose to exit from the class and teach in the formal classroom. So that both virtually and face-to-face, we have continued to experience it. And truancy exists for various reasons. We have the child who is bored and therefore finds other distractions, friends' homes to go to, right? We have the child who escapes to go by the river, to go to the beach, even though they are closed, right? And therefore, it takes a village to look after our children, as the old adage says. What we need to do as a community, as a nation, is to recognize that when children are out of school and truanting, that we do something. We make a phone call to the school principal, we contact the authorities, children authorities, whatever it may be, to get our children back into the formal schooling. Because at the end of the day, the more learning gaps they have means that they set themselves back, and we end up with more than a missing generation, as Alain Andel once said.
And there is something about truancy that I want to talk on in the other segment, but there's a Facebook question. I think the age for compulsory education needs to be reviewed. You agree with that, Ms. Rollock-Hackett?
Well, I think, you know, there's a lot of school of thoughts out there about that. And, you know, we can say yes because when we look at the students who sometimes tend to be absent and not regular at school, and if you were to look for the legislation that will back you up if you were to, you know, the matter were to be taken as a legal matter, then you recognize that what is currently stated up to 12 years is not sufficient. So you have the 15-year-old, you have the 16-year-old, etc., not attending school and, you know, probably engage in employment, etc. So we really need to have an expansion of the regulation as far as that is concerned to also involve those children. But I also just make a point on the private schools. Now, we have the act as it is, speaks specifically to the establishment of private schools and their relationship with the Minister of Education and what is required of them as far as maintaining certain standards and also being registered and so forth. But with the onset of the COVID-19, what has happened is that that entire sector has been severely affected. In addition to that, you have a lot of private schools now developing all around the country online. People are having private schools online, and many times they are not registered. And to be able to keep our pulse as the Ministry of Education, as a government, on this sector that is developing very rapidly, it is important that whether we decide to bring in another arm to support what is already being done by school supervisors as an inspectorate, to look carefully and to ensure that that sector actually delivers the kind of quality education that parents who are spending, there are a number of parents who are spending lots of money in this private sector, and it must really be regularized and carefully monitored. So I wanted to just comment on that.
And that is something that we're actually going to follow up on when we return from this break. Stay with us. We come back with more.
The following feature on TNT Icons in Science is brought to you by Nehurst, who is Trinidad and Tobago's first and only female aerospace engineer to work at NASA. Dr. Camille Waldrop Allen is Trinbago's first and only female aerospace engineer to work at NASA and is currently assistant program scientist with the International Space Station. To learn more on Dr. Waldrop Allen and other icons, log on to www.nehurst.gov.tt.
The turning of the sod for the construction of these two buildings occurred at the 60th anniversary of Hillview College, and on August 12, 2020, it was completed. The buildings will be used for the sixth form students as well as counseling area, which we know is quite needed right now in our schools. It will also serve as a teaching and learning resource center and a lecture theatre. I know that the principal, students and staff are looking forward to the use of the buildings whenever some sort of normalcy in children attending schools will return.
On behalf of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago and the Presbyterian Primary Schools Board of Education, I thank the government and the Ministry of Education for the completion of the rebuilding of this school. The project started about 7 years ago, and despite many challenges along the way, it has come to fruition. It has been a stressful time for the principal and staff, parents and students, during which they endured a fire that destroyed the administrative block, and classes were held in termite-ridden and less than acceptable classroom. The school's enrollment also dropped from 475 at the time when reconstruction started to 315 today. Today, therefore, it is with grateful hearts we give thanks that their dreams have been fulfilled.
As a former teacher and educator, I can relate, understand, and appreciate the excitement and anticipation of new and improved facilities. St. Augustine Girls High School is a hallmark of academic excellence, and the last 70 years have proven this.
I want to mention the role of the government in apportioning funding for education. I think it is extremely important to recognize that these are difficult times, and for funding to be able to be applied to these projects, it means that it is definitely a priority. This commissioning is very timely, and we've been at this for the last 2 weeks, doing 8 schools. Some new constructions, some like Hillview today, significant portions of the school have been added. All of us, therefore, have a vested interest in ensuring that the educational continuity for our children is maintained.
This was a production of Government Communications.
Welcome back. We are discussing the Education Act with Sherry Ann Rollox Hackett, Ashram Deoraj, and Darlene Smith. We're also inviting you to have your contributions. And there has been a question from Facebook. Does the Education Act consider designer schools as an important aspect of learning? Environmental design is a recognized aspect of learning. And I even want to put a little, preface on that, because it seems as though a little earlier, schools or just buildings, architecture in general, would be designed to allow as much sunlight, ventilation, air in as possible. Now it seems as though buildings are built to say, okay, how many people can we get into the building? And then we pump some air in, or we have fans. So it seems as though there's a little change in that juxtaposing those two. So what kind of work do you think will be going into design?
You know, I think that over the last, I would say 10 years, the designs of schools have improved tremendously. I myself was the principal of a brand new school, the Presal High School at the time. And the way that school was designed, we always had perfect airflow. If the AC went in, we didn't have a big issue. It was very well designed in terms of layout to maneuver yourself from one area to the next. The classroom sizes were good. Sunlight was perfect. So I think that we have developed to some extent through the Ministry of Education, that particular unit that looked at school design, they have improved over the period of time. There are examples like Waterloo Secondary and some others that were new, that are really new schools, that captures the kind of design that we want.
All right, and I want to go back to the point that Mrs. Rollox Hackett would have raised in terms of private schools online, and how do you start to bring these new institutions into the fold under the umbrella of the Ministry of Education? What are some of those things we need to look at in order to make that happen?
Private schools. So we have, as she said, a preponderance of individuals open up schools to teach online. It is critical to recognize that every child needs to be monitored. Every child can be susceptible to risk. And therefore, given that children could be placed in vulnerable positions, we have to ensure that there are inspectors, right, to be able to go in, right, school social workers, guidance officers, they'll be able to have to engage the child, to build that trusting relationship, to be able to share if something is going wrong.
And I want to add the caveat now of there may be a school that is already established, it's not a private school, it is under the ambit of the ministry, and a parent or guardian may see that there's something happening at that school that they want their child to be a part of. The child is already enrolled in the school, and being enrolled in the school means that you're supposed to be there full time. You may have extenuating circumstances where attendance is excused, but how do we build those bridges? So my child is in this school, but I can see that their passion lies in this area. Possibly a TVET school supplies that need. They have the resources for that. How do we start to build those incremental bridges to ensure that the child achieves its fullest potential? They're not marked absent when they're not in this school. What are some of those things we need to look at in order to do that, Mr. Dioraj?
Well, under a previous administration, I think it was 1980, 87, 88, somewhere there was an attempt to publicize schools for what they're good at. It was called the specialist schools. We often refer to them as magnet schools as well. And so if you look at St. Augustine Secondary, they were famous for PAN. And you will look for some other schools, they were famous for sport. And then there were some that were good for academics. So you had that kind of exposure to parents to let them make an informed choice when they're choosing a secondary school for their children. But that whole magnet school or specialist school system seemed to have fell away. But certainly if a child has the aptitude and the love for, let's say, PAN, and would like to go for a school, I know, for example, like St. George's College have an excellent program with music. So the parents can always apply for a transfer, try to get into that school, and that kind of thing. But it's a difficult ask. It's a difficult ask simply because there are some of the schools that are high performing that's a little more difficult to get into. But certainly the publication of what schools are really specialists at is certainly a way to go.
And I ask you that same question, Mrs. Rollocks-Hackett, in the sense that the new Chief Secretary, Farley Augustine, was talking about the fact that the education system needs to be looked at, and even, and I use the word that you've been using, relevancy. So if a school is near to a fishing village, and you have, beyond a shadow of a doubt, an idea that you're going to have a cohort of students from that school, most likely they're going to be fishermen. So that is something that is also brought into the school. How are some of the ways that we can build those bridges so that, yes, there is learning going on, yes, we can see that there's competence, and even it also sometimes even begs the question of how do we define a teacher? But what's your take on that, Mrs. Rollocks-Hackett?
All right, so it's interesting that you made that reference about a school located in a fishing village and the children wanting to become fishermen, because I found myself years ago in a circumstance where I was the head of a school located in a fishing village in an area that was well known for that. And I want to say that the children aspired to be a lot more than fishermen, and they embraced all areas of education. So even as we speak of relevancy and ensuring the curriculum is in sync with the interests of our learners, it must always be a diversified curriculum. As I spoke earlier about one that is inclusive and one that recognizes that our children, as they have different aspiration and ambition, and the system must cater for that. I must also mention, comment on what was said earlier when you gave the example of a child being registered and rightfully so registered in one school, but interested in a program in another school. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic would have brought that real and enhanced that reality for all of us in education. Because what we started to see happening is that you had children, yes, they were registered at one particular school, and because the program, the instructional program, was now online, There were parents who were registering their children online with teachers in another school. And those children were attending classes after hours. And sometimes when the teacher is required to be asynchronous with the other group, he or she might bring both groups together. So what it is saying, when you speak of the relevancy of the Education Act now, yes, it is still relevant. The tenets therein are relevant, but we have to consider some aspects of it because of the reality of how education is now viewed and how versatile it is now, so that students can move in a sort of vicarious manner from school to school and from classroom to classroom without any paper trail, really. And so, whether it is school supervision, whether it is student support service, all the elements must recognize these new areas in the delivery of education and ensure that we work them in and consider them in the Education Act and also in our standards for the operation of our schools. Yes, as far as the private schools, the regulation, the Act speaks to the fact that they must be registered. But a lot of these schools are not registered. So it's, to some extent, it will take us actually implementing what is there, because a lot of what is there in some instances are not being implemented across the board.
So how do we look to upgrade those education standards that deal with accountability, the versatility that some people find themselves being able to go from one class to another online? And while Mrs. Hackett was speaking, I saw two sets of pens furiously scribbling. So I don't know who wants to go first with regard to what it is you were writing.
No, I just had a comment to make in terms of, as you said, children want to do a particular skill in the school that they are. And I could point to, like, for example, Matloss Community College. Because of the location of that particular school, the children from years ago have started doing net repair and that kind of thing. And now it's going to expand with the principal that we have, who has a vision for the children there, and through dealing with the kind of employment that they will seek there, she started the small engine repair for both boat repair, looking at net repair and that kind of. She's going to introduce these kinds of skills to fit into that particular community, and the children, they are anxious to learn about it. So she has a ready group that that can get that new skill going. In terms of the private school, the legislation is there. It's a matter of enforcement. Yeah. It is a matter of enforcement.
So who enforces?
The Ministry of Education has school supervisors who are supposed to visit these schools. When I was there, I remember there's a particular school. A private school has to have the certain amount of ingredients, if you want to put it that way. School safety, you have competent teachers who are registered and so on. And once we found that it was lacking, we had to get the school closed down.
Mr. Deorat, that's supposed to is an interesting word, huh? But we have a Facebook contribution. Some students from the beginning of the pandemic to date have been experiencing a lot of issues which has affected the quality of their school lives. To what extent will the Education Act make provision for repeating a form, if necessary, at high school level?
That has been happening. I must say that for several schools, when we recognize for internet connectivity, we have allowed children to repeat, because at the end of the day, we want the child to maximize their potential. And how can we prepare the child for the world of work and the world of life if we don't give the child the opportunity? Because this pandemic was never planned for. It came like a great surprise at Tiffany night to everyone. So as the education system, we are providing children with opportunities to repeat currently.
And how does that work with regard to helping tool parents and guardians as well? Because this has been a surprise, like you said, for everybody, coming like a thief in the night. Children, students in the education sector, teachers, one of the recurring themes that we've had each night thus far is that we need to work on helping teachers more. Where do parents come into play? I'll ask you, please, Mrs. Rolex Hackett.
Well, I think, you know, we have always recognized our parents as critical, if not one of our most important stakeholders coming after our children. And what the pandemic did is that it really took this spotlight to some extent and placed it on the role of parents, the facilitating and enabling and the monitoring and the supportive role of parents. It was not that you provided them with food, clothing, and shelter, and you send them off at mornings and they come back in the day. All right? You, the parent, was now placed in a position, a very seminal position, to do a lot of what the teachers were doing before the pandemic. And therefore, you found parents, for many of them, the role was very, very new. And because it was very new, many of them found themselves, you know, in a position where they felt they were unable to do what was required to ensure the continued development of their children. So you had a lot of parents who were crying out and saying that their A+ students were now performing at a level that they will consider C, and therefore they cried out. But while they were doing that, we at the Ministry of Education and in Tobago, the Division of Education, Research and Technology, we have been working along with our parents, with the schools, with our student support service unit in order to guide our parents.
And that work, Ms. Rolex Hackett, is something that we want to discuss. That is something you want to discuss a little more when we return from the break, as well as the work, because I see you nodding as well. And as a motivational speaker as well, Ms. Smith, I need to get you in on this. Stay with us. We return with more.
The following feature on TNT Icons in Science is brought to you by Nehurst, who is Trinidad and Tobago's first and only female aerospace engineer to work at NASA. Dr. Camille Waldrop Allen is Trinbago's first and only female aerospace engineer to work at NASA and is currently assistant program scientist with the International Space Station. To learn more on Dr. Waldrop Allen and other icons, log on to www.nehurst.gov.tt.
The turning of the sod for the construction of these two buildings occurred at the 60th anniversary of Hillview College, and on August 12, 2020, it was completed. The buildings will be used for the sixth form students as well as counseling area, which we know is quite needed right now in our schools. It will also serve as a teaching and learning resource center and a lecture theatre. I know that the principal, students and staff are looking forward to the use of the buildings whenever some sort of normalcy in children attending schools will return.
On behalf of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago and the Presbyterian Primary Schools Board of Education, I thank the government and the Ministry of Education for the completion of the rebuilding of this school. The project started about 7 years ago, and despite many challenges along the way, it has come to fruition. It has been a stressful time for the principal and staff, parents and students, during which they endured a fire that destroyed the administrative block, and classes were held in termite-ridden and less than acceptable classroom. The school's enrollment also dropped from 475 at the time when reconstruction started to 315 today. Today, therefore, it is with grateful hearts we give thanks that their dreams have been fulfilled.
As a former teacher and educator, I can relate, understand, and appreciate the excitement and anticipation of new and improved facilities. St. Augustine Girls High School is a hallmark of academic excellence, and the last 70 years have proven this.
I want to mention the role of the government in apportioning funding for education. I think it is extremely important to recognize that these are difficult times, and for funding to be able to be applied to these projects, it means that it is definitely a priority. This commissioning is very timely, and we've been at this for the last 2 weeks, doing 8 schools. Some new constructions, some like Hillview today, significant portions of the school have been added. All of us, therefore, have a vested interest in ensuring that the educational continuity for our children is maintained.
This was a production of Government Communications.
Welcome back to the National Consultation on the Education Policy, where we are discussing the Education Act, and we're going back to Mrs. Rollock-Hackett just after we get some input from Ms. Smith. Thank you. In terms of helping or providing support to parents during this time and onwards, I guess.
Okay, so Student Support Services has continued throughout this pandemic to provide critical support to parents. Our normal parenting support for SCA students, CSEC, we're helping parents to do the transition, to helping parents to do study skills was always there. But a new critical area was, how do we help parents to log in? How do we help parents to cope with their son and daughter who was now stuck home with them literally for 24 hours? Previously, parents would have gotten a break. You went to school, so I got you back in the afternoon. But you now had parents who were now home with their children for this long duration, and they never had to do it. So new skill set and new training was needed, because it now meant also anger management and communication skills had to be brought in, because if not, the domestic violence levels and abuse levels were also rising, and we were seeing it, we were hearing it. We were actually sometimes delivering classes, and we would see and hear and overhear arguments taking place, and we recognized it was not healthy. So therefore we would step in and do the interventions with classes. We had to also support the parents with the autistic children and the children with disabilities who are now also home and having a challenge with the online learning. So it meant changing our delivery styles, but to inculcate and support all parents at different levels within the system.
And this actually reminds me of a conversation that we would have had previously with Alta, who were looking at some of the things that you would have itemized, Ms. Smith. But Mrs. Rollock-Hackett, very, very sorry for cutting you. You were talking about work that was happening with the THA, some very timely work. So I ask you to finish that point for us. Thank you.
No, I was just making the point about, as we speak about the parents and the expansion of the role of the parents, given the fact that we went virtual. So principals were asked or required, and I know that was done nationally also, to produce e-learning plans. And within those e-learning plans, they had included their expectations for parents, for students, and guidelines for the parents as to how they can go about navigating this new platform and also monitoring the children. I'm sure that we are all aware of in the early days, we had the various levels of FUPA as far as the use of Zoom and how we recognize it was not as a secured a platform as we wanted for our children. And many schools eventually migrated to Google Classrooms and so forth. And in doing so, you had a lot of programs that schools organize and principals organize, bringing in persons who had the necessary skill sets in order to actually teach the parents how they can go onto the Google Classroom and monitor and see the work, what was submitted, what was missing, and to see the marks that their children were gaining, etc. And that gave a lot of parents back a feeling of control of what was taking place. And these are things that we have to continue. Yes, the roles are expanding, but we can do it, and it has to be a collaborative effort between home and school.
And speaking of that effort, there's a question coming in from Facebook. Do our history/social studies books reflect our diversity? This was suggested many decades ago. School curriculum should be tweaked to address areas of relevance. I'm very tempted to send it one way, but I'll ask you for your thoughts on that, Mr. Deoraj.
Yes, I agree that we need to make sure that we are inclusive in terms of the kind of education that we put out in the social studies curriculum. While keeping our eyes on the local context, we have to react also to global demands. So therefore, our education system must take into consideration, in the social studies curriculum is quite apt at doing that, is given real-life experience and authentic learning across the curriculum. So I think that is a good idea. Maybe the curriculum writers will start looking at different aspects of our local content, but while at the same time looking at outside as well.
And Mrs. Rollocks Hackett spoke about parents feeling a sense of empowerment, being able to check up on their children, look at grades, look at what is happening. That is not possible with everyone in terms of that feeling of empowerment. And what can learning enhancement centers bring to the table to help address treat with disruptive students?
Learning enhancement centers traditionally have been developed, they're not new, right? They've been there really since the late 1990s to deal with children who are on extended suspension. It's an opportunity for us as the Ministry of Education to do intervention, but at a direct level. What we tend to do is remove the child from the school environment where they've been labeled, where they have been found to be failing and found to be lacking, and bring them into a center where we can do intervention with all our specialists, the guidance officers, school social workers, school psychologists or clinical psychologists or behavioral specialists. All have an opportunity to do individualized assessments in order to develop an IEP, individual education plans on the children, right? We have an opportunity to bring in the parents, and we do parenting sessions with them, individual sessions with the students, group sessions, and sometimes where necessary, bring in the parents to deal with the background family issues that may be impacting on this child's behavior. So that one of the things I would recommend for us to go forward in this new environment is to have dedicated centers, right, and dedicated staff. When we first started off, that's what happened. We had dedicated staff that really worked the program, and we saw tremendous successes. What has been happening, we have now pulled staff oftentimes from existing schools to temporary service centers, which has not been working. We need to have the dedicated staff and dedicated centers similar to Barbados. But Mr. Durant, you could talk about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Darlene. Since 1987, I've been preaching in terms of the Edna Nichols Center that exists in Barbados that I visited. And what you do in Trinidad here, the Education Act allows you to suspend a child for 7 days. The issue is that the child is suspended, they stay home from school, do nothing at home, and then or get into other kinds of mischief and then return to school. There is no dedicated intervention for that child. But in the Edna Nichols Center, when you get suspended from school, you are sent to that particular center. And on the Thursday of that first week, your parents come in. At the end of it, you get a report going back to the principal as what has been done. And the repeat offenders for the Edna Nichols Center was below 30% when I was there. So it means that it was working. And I agree with Darlene that if we have a learning enhancement center here, if you don't have dedicated staff, but dependent on pulling people from here and there to do the job, it's not going to work as well.
And we have about a minute before we end this segment, but you raised the point, Ms. Smith, speaking about individuals, as in students, versus treating with an entire family. I want you to expand on that a little more, please.
We have to recognize that children model behaviors, and if there's a dysfunctional family, if there's hurt in any way in the personal social realm of that child, they're going to act it out. They may not be able to voice that I am hurting, I am angry. So they acted out in bullying tactics, different behaviors in the school. So therefore, we must pull in the source of the problem, which may be the parents, to work along to do that healing and that intervention along while we simultaneously work with the student. And a critical that I want to state is that we cannot work with children who are intoxicated or high on substances. So that I would want to stress that some level of detoxing and some drug rehabilitation program needs to also be put into place for us to start to treat the children appropriately. We can't work and do any work when a child is coming to us high in the morning.
And are there possible stakeholders on the ground already that can be part of that exercise already?
Yes, we do have, and we have piloted. Just before the pandemic, we were working with 2 agencies in a pilot project to do such an intervention with our children. It is possible. We can do it. It means collaboration with police, Children's Authority, NAWDAP, and we can get it done. Yeah.
And one thing that we have not mentioned as yet, and I want us to do that when we return from the break, is where does homeschooling fit into all of this? But that is what we're going to do when we return from the break. Stay with us. We come back with more.
On Thursday, 1st July 2021, Dr. the Honorable Nyan Gatsby Dolly, Minister of Education, visited the Tranquility Government Primary School to ensure that all was ready for the 2021 secondary entrance assessment. 19,651 students nationwide wrote the examination under strict COVID-19 health protocols.
Schools are in a full state of preparedness for the exam. The children are out. They have all of their protocols in place for entry in terms of health and safety. The spacing in terms of how they lay out the desks and the chairs, that is in order and in line with the health regulations. The children seem to be quite excited and happy to be out today to do their examination, the parents as well. And so, of course, we at the ministry are very happy to be able to have this exam happen today. It's been an uncertain time for our students. They have not been in school since March of 2020, and so we are very happy to be able to do that. I want to thank the staff at the ministry. SEA is a huge undertaking. It's a mammoth task, and in this environment it was a lot more difficult, and I want to thank the staff for doing what was necessary to bring us to this point. And of course, the teachers, the parents, the students themselves for showing the resilience and ensuring that we can have the exam go off today. Well, the ministry's decision to reopen and how we reopen will be defined by our health circumstances, and so we take the guidance of the Ministry of Health. However, we have already started our discussions with stakeholders to bring together a guideline document such as we had for 2020-21 so that we can look at the possible reopening in terms of a physical sense, which is what we intend to get to. The Prime Minister has spoken very clearly on his hopes that this will happen. So we are working with that in mind to look at a guideline document that envisages a physical reopening in some sort September.
This message brought to you by the Office of the Prime Minister, Communications.
The following feature on TNT Icons in Science is brought to you by Nehurst. Which TNT reproductive biologist gained international recognition for his seminal work on the structure and function of the placenta? Professor Emmanuel Amoruso's research on the placenta laid the foundation for the study of modern obstetrics and gynecology and advanced the field of endocrinology. To learn more about Professor Amoruso and other icons, log on to www.nehurst.gov.tt.
Welcome back. We are discussing the Education Act, and thank you for making your views heard. Remember, you can post your comments and questions via Facebook. You can call us live to be part of the conversation at 622-4010. You can WhatsApp us at 776-0440, MOE.gov.tt. Make your contribution there, please. register your suggestion, your question, what you want to see towards the education sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And speaking of the education sector, saving this question now, and I want to throw it to you, Mr. Deoraj. Where does homeschooling play a role in the Education Act? Is it an oversight, a glaring omission? How do we treat with it?
Well, there is only one sentence in the Education Act that addresses homeschooling. And the minister, if the parents so desires to educate their children elsewhere, and they've set a set of conditions, then that sentence will apply, that they can homeschool. The issue has been for years, a couple of things. One, why did parents choose to homeschool in the first place, to disengage from the education system? And some of them said it's safety, some of them for religious reasons, sometimes the distance from where they live to the school, and they have other reasons. But the issue has been for me all the time, why have they so disengaged? But now there's a homeschooling association. So it's about time that the Education Act really expand, and I don't want to use the regularize, but certainly to add some legislative guidance in terms of how homeschooling should operate. Remember, at the center of it is the child, and we want to make sure that the child gets competent tuition, that the child in the surrounding that is best for learning. And one of the drawbacks, of course, that always bothers me is socialization of the child in terms of interaction with other children. So that if there are clubs available, if there are sports avenues that are available for the child, we have to make sure that if even a child were to, the parent were to choose homeschooling for the child, that all avenues are covered so that the child gets the best opportunity to realize. And one of the things that I always, apart from homeschooling, one of the things that have always struck me is that homeschooling is more prevalent at the primary school level than at the secondary school level. So that after the homeschooling period has ended, they sit the common exam of the SEA and then they go into the secondary school system. But I think that the earlier age where children are going to the primary, I think that the socialization and the interaction that is the drawback can be remedied. But I think that we have to put things in place legally to ensure that the child gets the best opportunities.
Well, Mr. Deoraj, one might say that the socialization of the child takes place through avenues of like the Homeschooling Association, the same clubs, and many of them happen outside of school hours so that the child is able to attend these, albeit virtually now in the most part, but there are opportunities and avenues for that sort of socialization outside of a physical, possibly brick and mortar setting for school.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that if you were to add the legislation to it, certainly the school social worker and student support services will get involved to ensure that these things are happening.
What's your take on that, Mrs. Rollocks Hackett? Homeschooling.
I want to say I totally agree with what Mr. Dura just said. I really think also that the entire system as far as homeschooling in Trinidad and Tobago need to be really regularized and structured. Yes, we have the Homeschooling Association, but I think we need to go beyond that and to include in the Education Act, just as we have done for private schools, to have clear guidelines and standards and tenets that will determine and guide parents who will elect to homeschool their children. Because homeschooling now has taken all different forms of permutations. And it's not that the parent themselves alone who will probably be the one delivering the education, but we have models where they are actually seeking experts who will come into their homes. Some parents are coming together and bringing their children under certain tutors in order to homeschool them. And while they're doing that, they're making them, they're availing themselves to national and regional examination, CXC. You can do CXC as a private candidate, so you don't need to actually go through the customer education system to be able to do CXC. And if they are the primary level, what many of them do is to ensure that they liaise with the Ministry of Education and also the Division of Education, Research and Technology to ensure that what is being taught, the curriculum, is in sync with the national curriculum. And sometimes even if they do the SCA, sometimes they do not take up the place at the high school. All right? So it is one area indeed that the act is very, very almost silent, as Mr. Duraj indicate. It's just a one-liner that speaks to it, and it speaks to it under compulsory education for students, right? So it is an area that we must, and as we have this consultation. May I also add, as you spoke about the LEC, in Tobago, we have there a dedicated center for our students who are on extended suspension, on suspension. And we have a dedicated staff that is located at Hope. And it's something that we are very, very proud of. And they work along with the staff from Student Support Service. And we also have a program where we bring in persons from different organizations, whether it's from the military or otherwise, to counsel those children. And let me say, even when we were online, that system went virtual. And now that we are starting to go back out, we have started sending the children there. Because it's not about when the children are about, being punitive, but to ensure that the education continue in a safe environment.
And that is something to be proud of, and rightfully so. And I guess we don't need to reach as far as Barbados, Mr. Deoraj, and I refuse to make any jokes about flying fish from Tobago waters. But what is your take on homeschooling, Ms. Smith? And looking at the fact that homeschooling, and I like the point that Mrs. Rollocks-Hackett made in terms of looking at the school curriculum or the education curriculum for similar age groups or levels, and making sure you're in sync with it, but homeschooling also allowing for a range of topics outside of those to be explored with greater depth while keeping in sync with some of these things. What's your thought on homeschooling with regard to that?
Homeschooling itself is a good thing in terms of the gifted child, in terms of the fact that the children with disabilities may not be able to access mainstream, and therefore that brings in the whole question about inclusive education. However, I need to say this, that while we recognize that the Conventions of the Right of the Child speaks of educating your children, we have mandatory compulsory education in Trinidad and Tobago from ages 5 to 16. My question always is, because we have experienced that while we have some children who have been successfully homeschooled, we do have the anomalies, and we can't ignore it. Those are the children who are being abused, who parents state that they're being homeschooled, but they do nothing with the child, and therefore the child literally is allowed to, the skills that are not developed, they shrink because they are left under no education, no stimulation, right? They're sometimes abused, they may be put, yes, to assist in the family business, it could be agriculture, whatever the case may be, but they're not attending any formal school. They're not even being taught anything in terms of the basic reading, arithmetic, science, anything at all. So that's a factor that we need to look at. And we had, I agree with Mr. Deoraj about the child who lacks the social skills, because oftentimes in SSSD we will have had to deal with Form 1 children who have been so socially isolated. They have a true problem now to interact with their peers in secondary school. This huge compound, they are totally at a loss, right? And they have issues with bullying, with peer relations, and therefore it requires careful consideration to ensure monitoring takes place and permission is sought, right, to ensure that you're removing a child from the formal system, which is your right to choose where you wish to educate as a parent, but to ensure that as you remove this child, he is protected, he or she is protected, and he or she really benefits under the conventions of the right of the child from all phases of their developmental milestones.
And I really like the fact that you speak about monitoring. So is it then that the Education Act needs to be a lot more expansive, inclusive, ensuring accountability between the parent and guardian who decides, who asks for permission and then decides that they're going to homeschool, so that there is a more continuous level of assessment, so that cracks are smaller, so you don't slip through them as well. So you have literacy, numeracy, and some of these core foundational aspects in development before we go forward, Mr. Deoraj?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And we have to look at it in terms of the aspect of, and get a differentiation between responsibility and accountability. Responsibility means that I have to do it. Accountability means that I have to account for what happens in terms of this particular child. And that is where the legislative framework will come in and the support will come in from student support services, etc.
And looking at how we do that, planning for the future. And I don't know if you had another point that you wanted to put in on that, Mrs. Rollox-Hackett, in terms of continuous monitoring, making sure that relevant subject matter is taught for people that is age appropriate, age for their level of development?
Under homeschooling, now I submit that yes, there are situations where students, their growth does not continue in the way it ought to when some parents decide to homeschool. And hence the reason why I said earlier that what needs to happen, yes, homeschooling is with us, and there are a number of parents and even more parents today who are seeing it as a viable option for their children. And what we really need to do is to set structures and to regularize it, include it in a real way, as I indicated earlier, in the Education Act, and speak to it as specifically as the Act speaks to private schools, that we must have a registry of homeschoolers, and we must also provide guidance. Our curriculum officers should provide guidance to the parents, whether it's in literature, making them available to them and making them aware of what is out there to facilitate and enable their children, because at the end of the day, these children will be in our wider society, and we have to also ensure their growth even as they are being homeschooled. As far as the socialization is concerned, there are models out there that have shown that there are situations of homeschooling where these children do not lack anything as far as socialization, because as I indicated, they come together and they ensure that they do things. I think Mr. Deoraj made mention of whether it's via clubs and so forth and so forth. But we need to expand our perspective of what schooling is all about, and do so in a very progressive and realistic and relevant fashion, and ensure that that also is reflected in the Education Act as we move forward.
Thank you so much for that. And what are some of those things looking to the future that you want to see the Education Act address, encompass a little more holistically? Because we've been talking about it with regard to homeschooling. What are some other areas that you want to see that in?
Well, I would like to see the education system looking forward in the sense of what it's offering and the purpose that we see education serving in the future. If we have an example of homeschooling where a parent chooses to disengage from the Ministry of Education schools that we have, then how do we ensure the quality, and we come back to quality, of the child's experience is the same no matter which school you go to, that the quality is standardized. So when we have reached that particular stage, then I believe that looking forward, we have to make sure that we work hard as a ministry, do the training that is necessary to ensure that we deliver on the promise of quality education.
And in terms of that level, or that increased level of parents and therefore children disengaging from the system like that, it'd be interesting to see if there are common themes that can be built on moving forward. But we talk about future planning. We continue speaking about future planning when we return, as well as getting a wrap-up comments from our panel. Stay with us. We come back for the last segment of this evening's consultation.
The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago has made a $50 million investment in the nation's future. The Ministry of Education, along with its public and private sector partners, distributed laptops to several primary and secondary schools in its drive to digitize education. The first module in this digitization plan was the Adopt a School program, part of government's public-private sector partnership, contextualized by Minister in the Ministry of Education, the Honorable Lisa Morris Julian.
11 months ago, Minister Dr. Dolly and I walked into the ministry and she made magic happen. Her first initiative of Adopt a School program was a roaring success. And now I'm very pleased to welcome our colleague, Minister Allison West, as we take part in the digitization of not just the ministry, but every single school in the country with government support. The future is now, and I'm pleased to be part of this program.
Senator the Honorable Allison West, Minister of Public Administration and Digital Transformation, explained their role.
There are all sorts of opportunities that this movement into the digital world allows us. The Ministry of Public Admin and its agencies, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago and iGovTT, are committed to working with the ministry to ensure that the schools, the children and the teachers maximize this opportunity.
Education Minister Dr. the Honorable Nyan Gatsby Dolly.
This act by our corporate sponsors and what's happening today brings our students and our focus clearly before the country. Education has moved digital. We have had to do this from March 2020, and in that mode, it was emergency mode because we had to close schools to prevent the spread of the virus, and we knew that we had children facing examinations, and the only way we could connect with them was in the virtual world. And it's not just about the device, it's not just about the laptop. The Teacher Training Division, which has been instrumental in providing the training for our teachers so that they would use the tool well. For our students, understanding how they use this tool. When we speak about the optimization of our school learning management system, when we speak about the procurement of ebooks, when we speak about dealing with the learning loss in math and grammar through the provision of a service online, when we speak about digitizing all of our school records, we speak about that not in the far distance, we speak about it now. All of us here stand together as a team working in the best interest of our children. And we are so happy to have come to this point and to say that we are here now, we have far to go, and we are about the business of transforming education, not by magic, but by hard and persistent work. And we understand what is needed, and we will do what we have to do.
This was a production of the Office of the Prime Minister, Communications.
The following feature on TNT Icons in Science is brought to you by Nehurst. Which highly regarded surgical oncologist born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago is now the head of Howard University in the U.S.? Dr. Wayne Frederick, a top surgical oncologist and head of the Howard University in the U.S., rose to great heights despite living with the debilitating effects of sickle cell anemia. To learn more on Dr. Wayne Frederick and other icons, log on to www.nehurst.gov.tt.
Welcome back. We are seeing that we are capable of greatness in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are looking at the Education Act to see how we can get even better at what it is we're doing. We remind you to post your comments and questions, as well as to make your voice heard via the ministry's website, the consultative process. That's moe.gov.tt. We're speaking with Mr. Ashram Deoraj, Sherian Rollocks Hackett, and Darlene Smith. Now, looking at the fact that we are perilously close to the edge, I think we should start to ask for some wrapping up statements, what we can expect the Act to provide for in the future amendments, future planning as it were. What are some of those things that you're looking forward to?
For the protection of our children, right? I'm happy that we are looking finally seemingly to see the end of the rainbow with regards to the inclusion of the ECC schools population into the Act. I think that's a critical thing to protect our children and to in terms of that level of the students. I also would like to see the inclusion of the battery of support staff that SSSD provides that was never there in the 1960s when the original Act came into existence. So because we now have school psychologists, clinical psychologists, school social workers who have the authority to visit homes, all of those things need to be entrenched and placed into the Act to protect the staff who do the assessments and do that critical intervention with the students going forward.
And we're actually going to be speaking about human resource development tomorrow, please God. So you'll want to look out for that. Mrs. Rollocks Hackett, your views, thanks. Closing comments.
Okay, I would like to see, in addition to what has been mentioned already, that our inclusion of, we talk about inclusive education, that it be really spelled out and included in the Education Act. It is time for us to move from it being a project, an inclusive school project, but make it a fundamental tenet of the delivery of education in Trinidad and Tobago by including it in the Education Act. Because if we begin to do that, then even the whole idea of how we design our schools will be different. Even the sort of facilities and the human resource that we will provide in many of our schools will also change. So I would like to see a great expansion in what is being said about inclusive education and the special needs sector.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Deoraj?
I'm very happy in terms of the topics that we have looked at tonight and trying to add some legislative teeth and grounding for things like homeschooling, the ECC center, the regularization of the learning enhancement centers, and so on. It all points to a holistic effort to ensure that children become the kind of adults we would want them to be, making a worthwhile contribution to society. And I'd just like to use 3 words to say what, when we look at the Education Act and we look at our schools, schools used to be reactive. The ministry used to be reactive, and then we started to be a little more proactive. I think it's time that we become predictive to ensure that 25 years from now, 30 years from now, what are the jobs looking like? What are the competencies and skills our students would want to have? And what will the purpose of our education system be? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ashram Deoraj. Thank you so much, Ms. Darlene Smith and Mrs. Sherian Rollocks Hackett. We want to thank you so much for your contributions to this very worthwhile endeavor. And as we already teased, you want to tune in tomorrow because we are talking about human resource development. I'm DK Roster. Thank you for joining us and see you tomorrow, please God.